Attention. Hull failure imminent. All personnel abandon ship. Launch in 3, 2, 1.
That scene of seeing the aurora for the first time in a playthrough always gives me chills. I absolutely love this game. I've never actually finished it, because even just seeing the stalker makes me mute the game, close my eyes, and throw my mouse across the room. But watching other people play it isn't so bad. So to celebrate one of my favorite games, I decided to make the location that I have spent by far the most amount of time in, Lifepod 5. I needed to first get some images of the ship, so I swam around and checked it out. I printed out a couple important reference images.
New blueprint acquired.
So it's time to find some junk to make this lumpy oval monstrosity. I obtained this slightly squishable bowl that came from a little mosaic candle thing that I had made. I also got this takeout box for its pretty corners to help bulk out the sides, because unfortunately this thing is not simply a circle. I trimmed them down to an appropriate size, then I used some tacky glue to double them up for more stability, and also because I'd already gone to the effort to cut out 4 pieces, so I might as well not waste them.
Oh, okay. We'll just really secure these, yeah.
Warning, ship's structural integrity is low.
Plastic doesn't always stick great to other plastic, especially with such a small connection point, so I glued on some EVA foam to help connect the pieces better. And with all that done, I finally attached the side pieces on to get this nice shape. Next up, more EVA foam. The savior of this project. Priority number 1 was to cover up this gaping hole.
Total hull failure in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hull integrity restored.
I wanted to get pieces for the separate chunks of the side, so I looked at my stash, but quickly realized that was not going to happen, and pulled back out the EVA foam. I cut out this big piece that fit around one side, then cut out some bits from that, starting with these sideways J shapes. I just sort of glued them on without measuring or trying to think ahead at all, and this will inevitably come back to bite me later. The next piece I looked at was the one between the takeout box and that foam piece, and I started by trying to use these thicker pieces of foam so I could blend it into the curved part better.
I spent a lot of time cutting this little bit out, trying to fit it onto here, but it just looks bad.
So instead I just got out the normal foam piece and decided to squish it a little to give it that curve.
Modifying mission parameters.
To help with that, I glued in some little pieces under where the curve happens to support the foam, and then I glued it all on. The first piece went flawlessly. However, the second piece was a journey. Somehow, at 750% speed and numerous time skips, I still spent centuries just comparing it to the bowl between cuts. Measure forever, cut never, as they say. Nobody says that. Maybe I should start saying that.
So for this one, I've tried to like piece it together and do that, and I'm like add stuff in. But for this, I'm gonna try a new technique, and I'm just gonna do the whole side EVA foam, and I'll try and like mark in stuff or cut out stuff after, or just straight up paint it. So how big of a piece will we need? Well, the bigger the better, right? So we'll just...
I started trimming this big rectangle down to size, putting my extra pieces in this exciting box of goodies that I have. At least I think it's exciting. It may look like this piece of foam is too big and hard to maneuver into place, and I agree.
It's too much body.
So I cut it into thirds instead. I glued on the middle piece first and was too lazy to hold it down to dry with my hands, so to keep it in place, I put my scissors on it, and then my glue. But the glue was actually too big, so I switched it with my X-Acto knife. Partnering with the X-Acto knife was my pen, and I moved the scissors over a bit so I could reintroduce the glue.
You know, it occurs to me that this is not cooking.
I wouldn't give up, however, so I tried it one last time.
I might just have to hold this, so I will.
After that stupid ordeal, I glued on the other pieces and trimmed them down. It looked pretty good, and I figured I would just try to fill in the 2 gaps between the pieces later on, or something like that. To get an idea of how it would look, and as a guide for some future pieces, I drew the design onto these foam parts with an erasable pen. It didn't erase well at all while I was drawing, so I kind of just gave up on that and drew over stuff because it would all get painted over anyway. It looked awful, to be honest, and I somehow ended up with one of the circles sort of looking like Rough Nut from How to Train Your Dragon. I feel like I really cannot be the only person who sees this, but I digress. I shoved in some bits under the sides for no real purpose and popped a slab of foam over it to sort of curve it in. In this regard, I actually think the original side looks better, and speaking of the original side, we are now going to put in the middle ladder piece. This was easy, just cutting down this strip of foam to the right size and gluing it on, then trimming off the overhang to get this masterpiece.
Now that we have this piece in the middle and all of this on the back, we are going to diverge and we're going to try and bulk out the bottom a little bit.
I had to trim this wooden piece's edges down some, but it was a nice piece to just get started by putting in there.
Fantastic. So we have our thing here. We have our bottom that we just put on. And now I have this piece of plastic that I'm going to attach to the bottom so that it will look somewhat like this.
I took this piece outside to sand it first for ease of gluing and later painting. Back inside, I wanted to trim a bit off the end so it fit better. I slashed and I cut and I pushed and I sliced and I sawed until finally I got the piece off. I cut some wood and other bits to help support it and experienced the tragedy of having to hear the Downton Abbey episode in my background audio as I edited this. If you know, you know. Once I had made a gigantic mess down there that somehow managed to hold up this piece at the proper angle, I moved on to the sides. I don't know where these bottles came from. I have never had any of these liquids, but this bottle was very helpful, so I guess it doesn't matter. I carved out its bottom part because it had an excellent fit to the Lifepod, but when I tried to cut it in half, no dice. None of my very safe brute force attempts worked, so I eventually decided to use my brain a bit and just cut around the indestructible piece of plastic in the middle. The pieces fit very nicely, an excellent curve to them, if you ask me. I sanded them and glued them on, and that was that done.
The goal right now is to try and find a suitable curve for this, and I'm like looking at this and wondering if it could work.
It didn't.
I just glued a piece of EVA foam on here. It's fun.
I had already thought out a plan for the inflatable hot dog part, which began with gluing on these pieces of cork. I had to cut the middle one smaller to make it fit, and while it dried, I covered up the holes in the bottom with some cardboard.
I'm gonna try and get some strips out of my box to just glue onto the corners so that these can fit without a problem.
I did this foam plan after trying to glue these ping pong ball pieces on like 20 times beforehand, and this worked so much better. Better late than never, I guess, but I must have wasted like a pound of glue trying to get these stupid things on. While I waited for the foam pieces to dry, I glued on the other side of the corks and made absolutely zero effort to get it in frame at all. This is cinematography. You're welcome. But there's no time to think about that, because we have now fast-forwarded to the future where everything is done. I constructed these little caved-in circles to be this part, and I suppose it feels relevant to mention that for the majority of the project thus far, I had a different idea on what to use. These pieces, and had been off-camera whittling away at them, which worked out 0% because I couldn't manage to cut the arrow off, and they aren't even caved in like the original, but the plan's better now.
I'm going to use some of these for the ladder. So I have some handy dandy other toothpicks to cut up. This one's just an extra. Cut.
I carefully glued together those little pieces until I had 8 half ladders, then 8 full ladders. I glued them on, but I would come to regret this later as it made it a lot harder to lay the Lifepod down at certain angles, and a bit more difficult to paint them. Next up, another ping pong ball. I cut this up to get the same shaped piece as the first side for the hot dog area. After this, things get a bit sporadic as I start to get pretty busy in school, so things start to become more messy and unorganized. Disorganized? I don't know. Disorganized. Case in point, this random side quest that I have to try and fix the fact that the ladder on this side is not at all centered. I ended up replacing it completely, and making a gigantic mess as I did it, and then I moved back to the other side to put on the ping pong parts for real this time. I measured them out first to make sure I didn't accidentally make this side's ladder very off-center. Not that it matters as much because nothing on this side is permanent. I glued them on and now have what I think looks like a pretty good bottom, though the ladders on the top are still kind of uneven, but whatever. Returning to the bottom, it's time for detailing. I roughly sketched out the shape I wanted for the underside hatch and looked for some options. After collecting them, I started trying them on. Some were too small, some were too big, some were just in the pile because they look cool, some looked impossible to cut, but one was just right. I decided to replace the cardboard semicircles next to it first because they kinda sucked and did not cover the whole underside. And after that, I glued on my hatch. Next, I designed the rectangles that come off of the hatch. They don't look three-dimensional in the game, but I thought making them a bit thicker would add some nice depth instead of it all just being flat. I made it out of cardboard first, but then I realized I didn't want the texture of the cardboard to show after painting, so I copied the cardboard piece onto some good old trusty EVA foam instead. After that came the other panels on the bottom. I drew the design that I would later paint onto them. I really didn't need to do this because the base coat later completely covered it up, but it was fun and helped me understand the scale a bit better, so I guess it doesn't really matter. I also randomly found this little bit that I thought would make a good outline for this light. I just squished it into the 4 spots where the light would go and left that for later. Next on the list of random and disorganized mini tasks was fixing these little lights. I really don't know what to call these. There doesn't seem to be any structural advantage to having added these like this. But then I'm not an engineer, so what do I know? Regardless, I wrapped these strips around them to cover up the holes and make it look cleaner.
So this side actually looks pretty good. Got it like that. You know what? It's not that bad. And then we turn it to the back, and it's not that good. Luckily, nothing on this side's that good. So we'll just keep it looking at this side.
Finally, it's time to get working on the top. I cut a piece up to make this nice base, then popped this cap on to finish it off. After gluing it on, I thought it would be impossible to find this piece for the hinge, but the Lady Opon's pull was strong on me today, and I found this little bit as a perfect match. I added a little cork piece to help bulk out the bottom for better support, then put it to the side until it was time to paint. I also attached these little bits to the opposite side of the hatch, and then what I assumed to be the handles on there as well. Like the ladders, it probably would have been smarter to put them on later, but such is the gift of hindsight.
So we patched up this side. It's actually the bad side, believe it or not. Oh, no, this is the bad side.
The patching up in question was these pieces, and I think I just used some glue and paint to try and smooth over some gaps. Clearly not this one. Anyway, it's time to paint. I put on a base coat of Mod Podge with light gray paint and got this ugly beast. I wasn't really sure where to start painting, so I just picked out the hot dogs and went for it.
It's looking a little bit orange. It looks oranger in here than it is in person, but I want to make it redder. So that was a terrible noise.
final thing to paint down here is these panels. The lines are pretty small, so to not mess it up, it was important to get a clean line on the first try.
Warning, endorphin levels low. Consider taking a seat and meditating. It may help to remember that problems exist only where you choose to see them.
Off camera, I painted in the blue spot for the hatch. It didn't glow like in the game, but I don't have glowy paint, so I guess that's that. Move into the top side now. I painted these black parts first, then started making the whole thing white. You may have wondered why my base coat wasn't white to begin with, but I don't have an answer for you. After that, it was time to try and find a slightly different shade of gray to put on this area. I got out this bottle which says blue-gray, and to me it kind of looks more blue, but it says gray on it, and I like the color anyway, so it's going on.
It looks, bluer than it does on the thing, but I kind of like it. I am conflicted, though, about what to do for the roof.
So while I debated how to paint the top hatch, I painted in these lines. This side was actually better for me for once in its life, because the lines that were there by it being pre-cut meant that it was really easy to follow and paint, though I was initially scared of putting too much paint down, so it looked kind of lumpy. Once I got over my fear, I started snaking around the top, and it was looking pretty good. On the other side, I prepped where the shape was going to end up. Then it was time for the freehand. After assessing from this side, it is very clear that they do not match up at all, and I went way too shallow. So I kind of just painted it again and resolved to hide the original line later with some white paint. Luckily, my second freehand line did not have this issue.
Whoa! That's a crazy eyeball. That actually looks good.
After cleaning my lines up, I had finally decided what to paint for the top hatch. I used this nice deep blue because one can just imagine that the window on the top shows all the way down to the ocean, and that's blue, and also the blue went nicely here, which was the main reason actually. Almost last, but far from least, was the yellow part. So, I got out my yellow bottle, unscrewed the cap, and spent the next 10 minutes trying to remove this ridiculously uncooperative cover. I think nations have fallen with less effort than I put into removing this thing. For the first things I did, I just put it straight on because I figured the gray underneath was light enough that it would be fine. But it really wasn't, so I redid them with an orange coat under them, and voila! I got out the same teal that is on the bottom hatch and used it to paint the light part for the dented circle area. Fortunately, unlike the hatch, these ones are on an edge, so I do plan to dry brush them later with a lighter color to make them look a little bit like they're glowing. But before doing that, I rechecked my reference images and realized my fake ladder lines were too dull, so I went over them with a pen to really make them stand out. Now, onto the main event. The fearful Lifepod 5. I didn't want to do that thing where you start out writing big, but then you realize that you're not going to make it to the end, so you have to start writing small. So I mapped it out first with this piece of paper to get a rough idea of the size it would need to be. Since historically I have a bad track record of painting neatly, I did a little paint test on the top of the paper to check that I could actually paint that small. And when it worked well, I just went for it. My fear of permanently messing up was unfounded because I actually did mess up twice before the final result that you see here. But I was able to dab some water on the earlier attempts before the paint dried to remove it pretty fast without any issues. After getting the letter size right, I bulked them out and started on the 5. The 5s on both sides look a bit different, but I think they really match with the way I wrote Lifepod on each side, so I'm happy with it. A few days later, about 45 minutes before leaving to go on a flight, I made these blue circles for the lights, and then these really awful circles around them. I chose to make them a bit blue because of some reference images I saw that looked like they gave off a bluish light, which I really liked. Especially because it fit with the other blue lights, while being a lighter shade to make it more interesting and diverse. After getting home from my trip, I cleaned the circles up and started what was meant to be the final step, dry brushing. I still don't think I fully understand dry brushing, so I'm sure they could have looked a little less wild, but overall I think the lights turned out pretty nice. I also dry brushed the hot dogs a little to add some weathering to them, because it kind of bothers me how the life pod gets ejected from the blown up ship, and I know the reason it stayed intact and, landed where it did is the reason your character survived, but why was the only damage like a minor radio issue that could be solved with a tiny laser stick? Like, you had no cosmetic damage. I was ready to finish recording and start editing this video together when I looked back at my reference sheet for the final time and noticed a black line that ran across the hot dogs.
New objectives added.
I debated ignoring this at first and not putting it in because behind the scenes I had secretly repainted the hot dogs with a new and improved reddish orange that I knew I would never be able to combine to again, but I just decided to go for it and pray that if I made a mistake, I would be able to clean them up quickly by dabbing some water on them, as I was an expert at that now. Fortunately, I didn't have any issues with the line, so
That's us done.